Right, and so to this evening, I thought before we invite our panelists up, we'll take a look at some pictures of what's been going on. And AFP have been blazing a trail on the stills photography here, producing some amazing images. And we've also got pictures that go right back, also from AFP, to the Thaksin period. And we have Jerome from AFP to talk about them.
Hi all. For those who don't know me, I'm Jerome Taylor. I'm one of the Southeast Asia correspondents based in our Bangkok bureau here. We wanted to get a few photos together, both of some of the photography that has been coming out of our Philippines bureau recently, but also I wanted to go into the archives and have a look at what we were shooting in 2003 and 4 when Thaksin did his war on drugs as well, and the similarities are quite profound in many ways. So some of these early pictures that are coming on the moment are from the Thaksin era. I'm not gonna talk as the pictures go through because they take a bit of time, but you'll see as these pictures scroll through, you've got everything from Thaksin signing his initial declaration where he declared a kind of war on drugs, through to the usual police perp walks and things like that, and also dead bodies on the floor, on the streets, in taxis, etc. One of the captions I read early on in the drug war mentioned that 24 days into Thaksin's drug war, the government announced 963 drug dealers had been shot dead. It's a huge number if you think about it, in the first 24 days. I know Nick Nostitz and others will talk in more detail about those figures, what they mean, how many were and weren't dealers and the rest of it. These later pics are by Noel Chelis, who's one of our Filipino photographers. He's been doing some fantastic work in the last couple of months. He's been pretty much working a 18, 20-hour day. He has his kind of day job. And then in the evening, he just mans the police radio. And sadly, there is no shortage of places for him and other Filipino photographers to go to. The pictures speak for themselves. But the one thing I'm just going to do is read out. He wrote a very nice blog about what it's been like the past few months to do some of this work on what, even before this happened, Filipino photographers called the graveyard shift, but it has now depressingly become a genuine graveyard shift. And in this blog, he talks about a photograph that he took, but also others did as well, that went very viral, of this photo here, which was of a woman who was holding the body of her boyfriend, who was a rickshaw driver, and I think he was a drug user rather than pusher. He was killed. Anyway, Noel went down there, and he said there were a lot of photographers there shooting their third death of the night. The woman shouted, "Stop shooting and help us instead." We were shell-shocked. Some of us simply stopped shooting. Many of us began to question our motives. Why are we doing this? We're like vultures. We couldn't eat that night. We couldn't talk on the ride back. Everyone felt guilty that we hadn't been there to help. Later, one local newspaper photographer who had been there that night quit covering the graveyard shift. I'll leave it there.
Right, thank you, Jerome. If I could invite the panelists that we do have, Sam Zafiri, Sunai Phasuk, and Nick Nostitz to come up. We have Walden Bello on the way, who will give a big picture view of what's transpiring in the Philippines at the moment. But basically, the story is fairly straightforward, and that is that Rodrigo Duterte won a massive landslide election and became president. And during his campaign, he very, very clearly stated that he intended to take on the drugs problem in the Philippines and restore law and order, and was thoroughly open about the fact that this would involve killing people, which is now what's transpiring. So we've had in excess of 700 shootouts with police and in excess of 1,000 killings of individuals by vigilantes. And of course it says a lot about the situation in the Philippines, but basically Duterte stands on his record as the mayor of Davao in Mindanao in the southern Philippines, which goes right back to the 90s, which is one of the safest cities in the country and has actually very good records on certain things. So it's a very, very contentious area. Now, I think I'll just introduce our panelists as they appear, as they actually exist. So we have Sam Zafiri from who's the Asia Director of the International Commission of Jurists, and he also previously worked with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And he's been covering human rights crises and conflicts from Afghanistan to the Philippines, and was very recently in Manila meeting with Philippine lawmakers who are at the moment sponsoring these Senate hearings into the killings. And so he's going to talk to us. Then next to him we have Sunai Phasuk, who's going to talk about the situation in Thailand. So we'll go back to 2003. And Sunai is, of course, a very regular speaker here. He's a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch, and looks at all the related issues in Thailand and Burma. And he's a frequent speaker on the media. And then at the end we have Nick Nostitz, who's a regular club member, photojournalist. Nick has covered the politics of Thailand over the past 15 years, would it be? 10 years. In very, very close detail, closer than probably any other Western photographer, and got himself into many scrapes and assaults. But anyway, he cut his teeth in many ways on the Thaksin war on drugs, so he has some very interesting perspectives. So Sam, on that note, can I ask you to tell us what you've been up to in the Philippines lately?
Thanks for that. And we were just in the Philippines to look at the human rights situation there, and particularly the killings that are taking place there. And you've gotten a sense of the scale of the killings that have taken place. The Philippines has, over the years, had and continues to have, obviously, a problem with extrajudicial killings. What's very odd, what's very unusual about what's happening right now, unusual both for the history of the Philippines, but really around the world these days, is the explicitness with which the government has actually embraced, if not espoused, this policy. And that's particularly significant because it has real-world legal ramifications. You're looking at these pictures, so just to kind of set the stage and explain a little bit of what all of this means under international law. You've heard this, and in the Philippines itself, these killings are often referred to as extrajudicial killings. Now, that has an actual specific meaning. Whether it's by the police, as many of these killings are, they are described as so-called encounter killings. The suspects are putting up a fight, and so they pull out a gun and the police say that they've killed them, or vigilante killings. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and basically international law these days, defines extrajudicial killing as the deprivation of life without full judicial and legal process, and this is the crucial part, with the involvement, complicity, tolerance, or acquiescence of the government or its agents. So, obviously, killings on the street tend to be, if it's done by vigilantes, are extra legal. There's no legal sanction for them. But then the crucial part is the complicity, tolerance, or acquiescence of the government. And I'll come to that. In terms of the killings by the police, that's also specifically under international law viewed as part of extrajudicial killings, because death through the excessive use of force by police or security forces falls under this category. And the hearings that were just had in the Senate by Senator De Lima, former Minister of Justice in the Philippines, really focused on this. They said to the government, look, whoever is killing these people, there are a lot of bodies that are showing up. People are being photographed, being killed on the streets. What are the police doing about it? Are they investigating it? Are they trying to understand why this epidemic is suddenly sweeping through the country? I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, what's crucial about extrajudicial killings is that, as you would imagine, this is not just a crime under domestic law, but also involves international law. Now, ordinarily, extrajudicial killings under basic international law, when they occur on a massive scale, essentially, and when they're viewed as having state involvement, become potentially a crime against humanity. And that's an important thing to remember, because suddenly we are now talking about crimes against humanity. So that's something that under international law already requires international attention. And we've seen statements from the UN Human Rights Mechanism about this and demanding the Philippines government to do something about it. The situation in the Philippines is particularly interesting because the Philippines has actually signed itself up to the International Criminal Court. It's signed what is called the Rome Statute. And under the Rome Statute, a crime against humanity is something that can be taken to The Hague. And that's something that is a crime, such as extrajudicial killing, that is committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack. Jonathan, who's just arrived, can probably talk about the widespread nature of this. Some of this is just almost a quantitative measurement, particularly its scale. Now, there's no set of victims. We can't say that 10 victims is not widespread, but 200 are. But we are very comfortably in the range of what is considered widespread. Once we're looking at hundreds, and now we're up to, let's say, over 1,000. We're very comfortably in the realm of what under international law and the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Court is widespread. So that in and of itself is enough. We've already reached that threshold. What's egregious, unusual, interesting for lawyers in the Philippines is, what does it mean to have a systematic campaign? And systematic involves a pattern or methodical plan. Now, in international law, this is always what's been very complicated. Usually leaders around the world try to distance themselves from international crimes. So in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in Indonesia, going all the way back to Nuremberg, there was never, or very rarely, was there a clear order from the government that says, okay, go ahead and kill all of these people. So international law has come up with a number of factors to consider. How do you hold a leader responsible for crimes against humanity and show that it's a systematic policy? And among those are numbers, existence of a pattern, but crucially, public statements, a plan or a policy targeting the civilian population, and the involvement of political or military authorities. And what's astonishing about what's been happening in the Philippines, I think that the journalists are all very happy about this because it just keeps giving and giving, but this notion that statements such as, and I'm just citing some of these from President Duterte, before he was elected, he said, and I quote, "All of you who are into drugs, you sons of bitches, I will really kill you." Now, that in and of itself would suffice to show a premeditated policy. Some of the others, in just a few weeks ago, he said, "My order is shoot to kill. I don't care about human rights. Believe me, I don't give a shit about what they will say. This war is against drugs, and we have a crisis." Again, this is the kind of thing that international prosecutors like my colleague Kingsley Abbott sitting over there working in Cambodia would have spent years and years going through newspaper interviews, internal documents, and so on to find. And we have these coming all the time. I'll stop there with saying that, therefore, this creates an unprecedented situation almost. We really did not envision the Philippines putting itself in a position where potentially the International Criminal Court would be interested in what's going on in the Philippines. Just to clarify, under the International Criminal Court, President Duterte's position as the head of state is irrelevant. That's written into the law. Doesn't matter what your official position is. And as we've seen recently from, for instance, the al-Bashir case coming out of Sudan, it's you're on it. I'll end by saying that's actually not, the ICC, of course, is busy dealing with a number of cases, but even more likely, depending on where President Duterte ends up, I'd just like to point out that under international law, crimes against humanity can be brought up, can be charged in a number of places. Technically, almost everywhere. In practice, certainly in Europe and in the US, under the doctrine of universal jurisdiction. That is, every government has the obligation, in fact, to put on trial somebody who is accused of crimes against humanity. We've seen the Pinochet case being kind of the famous instance of this, but we have a number of these. In the US, it's particularly interesting because they have a slightly different system, but we had the case against Ferdinand Marcos, in which 10,000 victims of torture, killing, and disappearances filed a class action lawsuit against Marcos, and they were awarded $2 billion. So now, in that case, Marcos had put all of that away. I don't think Duterte has that. But just to say that we are now in kind of very odd international law territory, in that President Duterte seems absolutely inclined to say things that seem to make him vulnerable to international prosecution, and if this trend continues, almost would compel it. I would expect very soon he will be unable to set foot in much of the West because people will be following him with a lawsuit, and I have to say I look forward to seeing him in the dock, because as he has said, he doesn't give a shit about human rights, but I think human rights really do give a shit about what he's doing. So I'll end there.
Great, thanks. Jonathan, are you relaxed and with us?
Yeah.
Of a stressful arrival.
Yeah, thanks.
So look, can we ask you to pick up and
Absolutely,
describe?
yeah. I mean, I literally have come straight back from Manila. I've spent the last 11 days there doing a lot of reporting, a huge amount of filming, and a great deal of talking to what is now a very divided country. And it's interesting listening to Sam there. There is a very different context inside the Philippines as far as Filipinos are concerned right now. There is actually a huge amount of support for what President Duterte is doing. But it is very divisive. There are Filipinos, it's very much like we've seen in Thailand in the last 10 years. People are losing friends, families are dividing. It's very, very bitter. And those of us who've covered the Philippines for quite a long time haven't seen this before. You know, we always imagine the sunny side of the Filipinos. Well, you know, I can tell you it's not sunny anymore. I'll say a couple of things. I covered the election in May. And I was very struck then by how Rodrigo Duterte had tapped into something new in the Philippines. You know, he tapped into a profound frustration, dissatisfaction with the status quo, which had been masked really because of the Filipinos' very, very enthusiastic participation in the rituals of democracy. and that hunger for change has really been fixated on, and by not just poor Filipinos. Those of you who remember the election of Joseph Estrada back in 1998 will remember that was driven very much by a hunger for the poor, for some kind of symbol that they could look up to. This is also the middle-class Filipinos too, who say they're sick of the system, they're sick of the last government. However rough Duterte is, however awful his methods, something's got to give. Their system is bankrupt. It's a profound collapse of faith in the democracy that was ushered in 30 years ago with the first People Power Revolution. What we didn't really know about Duterte was really how ruthlessly and quickly he would actually put into practice this extraordinary threat to go out there and kill criminals. I mean, there were parallels definitely with Donald Trump. There's no doubt about it. He certainly enjoys being outrageous because he knows that gets attention, and he's running very much as an anti-establishment figure. But he's also an experienced administrator. He's a very smart man. He's a lawyer. He's got that 30 years of experience in Davao. He's also got an unusual range of sort of ideological positions. He positions himself economically and in many ways politically on the left. He's quite close to the communists. He believes in shaking up the political system. So he's a far more interesting character in many ways. Now, when I went into the Philippines this time, we started looking into the extrajudicial killings that are going on there. And I produced a report. Some of you may, I don't know if any of you have seen the report. We actually tracked down, I was looking for actually a drug dealer on the run, and it was pretty hard to find, as you can imagine. It took a lot of quite complex contacts to find somebody in hiding. But the contact I found, who happened to know the drug dealer, also knew a team of assassins. And he said, I can get you a female assassin. In fact, he had a female assassin in mind who doesn't mind talking about it. She uses a kitchen knife, does 3 slashes to the throat. She's killed quite a lot of people. On the day we were supposed to interview her, she and her husband, their safe house was broken. They were advised by their boss, who was a police officer, a corrupt police officer involved in the drugs trade, to go underground. In the same team, he found another assassin. I've actually got I can probably play you something here, which is... bring it up. This is just some video of both the drug dealer and the assassin that we interviewed. It's been very controversial, this page on the BBC as the highest viewed feature page in the BBC from Asia than anyone can remember. I think a lot to do with Filipinos engaging. I've received massive amounts of hate mail. I was attacked today by one of President Duterte's allies, his candidate for the vice presidency, who's claimed that my source can't be correct. I can promise you the assassin we interviewed could not have been faking it. She was genuine. She was very scared. She hadn't really thought about what she was doing. She killed one person when her husband brought her into the business in 2014, and then nobody else until Duterte won the election. And since the end of May, she's killed 5, and she wasn't feeling too good about it. While that's coming up, I will just talk a little bit also about figures. Let's just put this up.
Got sound.
Ganda pa, no? Nakakapagod, nakakatakot na palagi kang tago ng tago. Hindi mo malaman kung yung kaharap mo, maaari yung kaharap mo magtuturo o yung kaharap mo ang papatay sa akin.
So this guy called himself Roger.
Ganda pa, no? Nakakapagod.
We met him in an anonymous hotel room. He had to be smuggled in.
Hindi mo malaman kung yung
He's not just a low-level runner, as they call it. He's elevated to being a dealer, so he's quite high profile. He also works with the police. He told us that he goes on raids with the police, or used to before the drug crackdown, and he would get half what they confiscated from raiding drug dealers, and then he'd be allowed to sell it and give them help and share the profits with them.
Paglapit ko sa tao na yun, laki po ang utang yung subos namin eh. Ako po, tinikitan po yung tao, saka po pinarel. Sumunod po na pangyayari na yan, itong May na po na si President Duterte na po ang mula itong August, 5 na po ang natutong kabali po, 6 lahat.
She's a young woman in her 20s, quite small, had 2 children. She came to us to the hotel room carrying an 11-month-old baby. She clearly hadn't really thought much about what she does until I started asking questions about what she would tell her children.
na nagiging addict? Or malaki din ang kasalanan ko na nagiging mas marami ang tao na nalululong sa drugs kasi nga isa rin ako sa nagbebenta ng drugs.
Hanggang sa one time po na kailangan po ng isang tao na kailangan po ay babae. Na hindi po kayang tikitan po ng mga kasamahan ko po. Ako po ang pinatitikit. Una po naramdaman ay takot at nervyos. Dahil po dahil sa first time ko po, dahil po yung isang anak ko po ay kaya ko po nagawa sa anak ko po.
Ako, sa sarili ko, addict din ako eh. Pero hindi ako mapatay. Addict din ako, pero hindi ako nagnanakaw. Addict din ako, pero hindi ako gumagawa ng krimen. Lalong-lalo na yung papatay.
Pero ako sa ngayon, hindi ako na pumaulit to. Asawa ko na lang po ang naano niya. Kasi po, pag ito pong ang boss po namin, pag isa sa amin po ay kumalag sa grupong ganito, kami po ang itutumba. Natakot din po ako. May konsensya rin. So, pero lagi ko po sinasabi sa asawa ko na hindi naman habang buhay na ganyan ang trabaho natin. May mga anak din tayo. Kasi ayoko rin naman lumaki mga anak natin na namulatan nila na ito ang trabaho natin sa... Ayoko rin po sumbatan tayo ng mga anak natin na pinitabuhay natin sila sa pamamagitan ng pagpapatay ng tao. Just konting pera lang.
Now, I've been attacked by actually an organized campaign, but a lot of people are genuinely absolutely indignant about this. They're upset that they say I suggested in my report that President Duterte directly sort of contracted this woman, and that's not true. And this is, there's a huge amount of debate going on about this. I mean, Duterte has quite clearly said, I want this problem cleaned up, very similar to what Thaksin did. I want people killed. I mean, he's made that very clear. So he is culpable, and he must know what the consequences of his actions are going to be. In fact, she's working, what happened was her husband went to jail for murder. He was offered by a corrupt policeman in the jail a chance to get out if he would work as an assassin, knocking off people who owed the police boss money. She was brought into it. So she doesn't know why the 5 that she's killed since Duterte came to office were targeted. She never asked that question. She just goes and kills them. But it's quite possible he's cleaning up. He's possibly killing people who've got incriminating evidence about him. But one thing is very, very clear about this. Almost everybody who's been killed, it's around 2,000 now, in extrajudicial killings. And this is, whatever the arguments about statistics, this is a massive increase. The statistics for murder in the Philippines last year was 7,245. That's murders. It includes, domestic murders, things like this. This is 2,000 targeted killings. It's a whole lot higher than normal. The number of targeted killings is probably only 1,000 to 2,000 a year. We've had 2,000 in just 2 months. And they're almost all poor. And the president has actually met accused drug lords in his office and tried to persuade them to give up. And there are people saying, well, if you're so keen on killing people, why didn't you pull out a gun and shoot the guy in your office? This guy, one of them, Peter Lim, who's accused, has now fled overseas. And it's clearly, from the people we spoke to, we went to one neighborhood. We've got some CCTV. I won't show you now, but it's a guy getting shot by a motorbike passing in tandem. And we went and talked to his wife and all the neighbors. And it was quite clear he wasn't even a drug dealer. He'd been involved in taking drugs. He was knocked off, they think, because of a dispute, again with a policeman, over running a gambling racket. They're not sure. Everyone was very angry about it. I went into other neighborhoods that were said to be very bad for drugs. One in particular was recommended to me called Concha Madrid. It's in Tondo. It's one of the barangays there. And the barangay chief there said, well, we've got 16 people who registered as drug users. He said, there are probably more, but these are the guys who everyone knows. That's 16 out of a population of 5,000. It's not an epidemic. It's bad, but it's not an epidemic. And he was baffled. He supports Duterte. He thinks he's a good guy. Interestingly, the wife of the guy we've got the video being knocked off, also voted for Duterte, although she should never do it again. This barangay chief said, we've got them registered, but we don't know what to do with them now. They're off methamphetamine for the moment because of the attack on the drug trade, and this is very similar to what happened in Thailand. Supply has gone down, so the price is going up, so the poor people can't afford it. But without rehab, without taking out the people at the top of the trade. And it's a very big trade in the Philippines, and the president is right. It's at the very top levels, and he has identified people. If you don't deal with that, you're clearly not going to solve it. It's a very heartless operation, this. Duterte knows what he's doing. I think it's basically, it's shock and awe. He's gone in there. He's an outsider. He is up against an establishment that doesn't like him, although he's not a marginal figure. He comes from an establishment family himself, but it's a regional one in Mindanao. He's brought a new non-Manila sort of package of people and networks into the palace in Malacanang, but he's up against the wealthy families who've run Manila for years. And I think he figures that by doing this, he's going to shock everything, create space, and get results. And it's what he's done in Davao. He's been mayor off and on over 30 years there, using pretty much these tactics. It's very brutal. It does have a lot of support. We can talk about, international human rights campaigns, about taking President Duterte to court. There will be an uproar in the Philippines. They're already, it is incredible how much this country has turned and how many people now think, yes, it's all. I've spoken to people who say, I don't like it, I don't like the killings, but something's got to be done, and he's the only guy who can do it. Nobody else would have done this. We've got to give him a chance. And remember, he's trying to do a lot of other things as well. He wants to introduce a federal system. He's got a lot of ideas about helping the poor. How far they go, it's very hard to say at this stage. He's a man with a massive agenda. He's also an old man as well. He's 71. This will be his only term of office. So it's very hard to know what he will do. But my impression was of a really quite tragic campaign where everybody wants something done. He's doing something. The victims are all poor. Probably nearly all of them have some kind of connection with drugs or some kind of taint. But a lot of them, it's very marginal. You're leaving people without husbands, without brothers, without sons. I mean, it's an awful, awful price to pay. And
not
the
going to
fact
seek
is, the
to
top
remain in the European Union, to rejoin it by the back door, or to...
Sorry, that was the BBC.
And yet, that public support is going to be there. And it'll be fascinating to watch how the Philippines does with what Thailand's had to deal with, which
like
is very,
the UK's
very
future
bitter.
relationship with
UK. Jonathan, was it your impression that more people supported it than opposed it?
Yeah, I mean, the guy's got, the polls say 91% support at the moment. I found a profound difference between middle class and poorer support. At the poor levels, people want another strong man. These are people who are sentimental about Marcos. They all say the country was better. They're people whose lives are always crap. I mean, the inequality is chronic in the Philippines, and they vote in large numbers each election, hoping that the next president will sort them out, and they like the idea of a strong guy. It's why they voted for Estrada. It's why they're sentimental about Marcos. At the middle class level, it's very different. You've got the same kind of bitter frustration and anger there that we saw among the PDRC, for example. Interestingly, that these people are supporting an abrasive populist, whereas the PDRC was supporting an establishment against an abrasive populist. But both of them have echo this kind of feeling that their country has failed, that they're embarrassed, that they feel something just has to be done. And in the case of the PDRC, they felt they should just rip up their democracy and ultimately, in effect, invite the military in. In the case of these frustrated middle-class people, many of them regional rather than Manila-based, there's a feeling that let's let Duterte do what he's got to do, and it's very sad if a lot of people lose their lives, but that's what's got to happen. On the actual effect of the drugs, I mean, the statistics are really hard to pin down. Duterte says there are 3.7 million drug users. He then also says in the same breath that these people, after a year on methamphetamine, are wiped out, they're wasted, they're useless to society, their brains are fried, as almost as though they're discarded. It's a hell of it's 4% of your population. That wasn't my impression. And he's done very much what happened in Thailand, which drove the support for Thaksin's war. He's latched onto some awful, sensational crimes. I mean, truly awful ones of people on meth who've done dreadful things. But actually, you go into the barangays, there are, thousands and thousands of people on meth they're messing up their families, they're messing up themselves. But at most, they're stealing a bit. They're not doing much else. And there's, among middle classes who don't have to deal with the meth problem, it's mostly in the poor neighborhoods, this fear that a crazed meth addict is going to come and slash their children is basically being fueled by a president who goes on and on about it. The president goes on about a few examples, as though every single one of those, if it is 3.7 million, I'm not convinced, people is a sort of mass murderer on the edge. And that's been really fueled. But it is also a president who loves shaking things up, who's got one term, who genuinely wants to change. I mean, he sounds like a movie character when you listen to him. I mean, he's clearly borrowed a few lines from Clint Eastwood. It is extraordinary listening to him. He is Mr. Angry, something's got to be done, I'm going to do it. And he's got a lot of support. I mean, you should read the social media war that's going on now in the Philippines. It's absolutely brutally bitter. Insults, savage stuff. A lot of it organized as well. It's a very unpleasant environment and very unfamiliar for those of us who've been in the Philippines before.
Right, Sunai, is this Thaksin Redux, what do you see going back to 2003 in Thailand?
Yeah, well, in many aspects, you know, watching what is going on now in the Philippines is like, you know, a replay of Thaksin war on drugs. But first of all, I think what I would like to address first is that, you know, Duterte has become very popular in Thailand for what he is doing. The extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, his contempt of international condemnation by the UN, by the foreign government, by the Western governments, human rights groups, has won Duterte huge support in Thailand. And the rhetoric that, you know, that I observe among comments praising Duterte is they're exactly the same as when these people praised Thaksin in 2003 as national hero, who disregard international human rights obligation, respect for due process of law. Something has to be done, as Jonathan said. And there's also similarities in the sense that drugs have been vilified in the lead up to the declaration of the so-called war on drugs campaign. Way ahead of that, it was prepared for that moment. That, you know, through the media, that, you know, daily coverage about people got, you know, hide up as a result of methamphetamine, took hostages, killed the hostages, wounded the hostages in a very brutal way, you know, slashing the throat, dump the body in front of cameras. That happened, and the in parallel to that, you know, broader context of this kind of very graphic images is the rhetoric at national level that, you know, Thailand has been one country that has identified drugs as high priority national security threat. It started from opium and later on heroin and then methamphetamine. The name in Thai changed from Yama to Yaba, that, you know, to the craze pill. And you have, like when Jonathan said about, you know, this kind of faction support in the Philippines, but in Thailand there's almost kind of unified support for drastic actions against the proliferation of drugs. And in this case, methamphetamine, you have, you know, the symbol of the establishment, General Prem, the president of the Privy Council. And then you have like populist politician Thaksin and his network speaking in the same tone that, you know, back then, if you drove past Lad Prao intersection, you know, Chatuchak Market, you have big poster, big billboard of General Prem doing this. Drug traffickers are traitors. They harm our people. And then when Thaksin declared war on drugs, the same rhetoric was echoed. There was no hesitation, regardless of their political orientation, that something ought to be done, including going beyond the boundary of the law. And I would cite what Thaksin said when he declared war in 2003. He said, because drug traders are ruthless to our children, so being ruthless back to them is not a bad thing. That was when he launched the first war on drugs, starting from February 2003 and ended in April 2003, 3 months. But during that 3-month period, again, you know, similar to the Philippines, we saw a surge in murder rates. A commission inquiry that was set up after Thaksin was ousted in a military coup. There was a commission of inquiry chaired by former Attorney General of Thailand. And they found that there were at least 2,800 murder cases during that 3 months. Many folds from the normal rate of murder, annual murder rate in Thailand. Nick will talk. He said, I cannot take this topic from him. He wanted to talk about the breakdown, so I leave that to him. But there were at least 2,800 murder cases during the period of the war on drugs, the first period of the war on drugs. None of these murder cases have been properly investigated, including cases that have evidence strongly implicated government officials, both police and security forces. And in Thailand, we also have militia associated with the government, such as the OSOR, defense volunteers attached to the district office. None of these have been investigated. Cases that shown in front of camera or police open fire and kill bystanders remain uninvestigated, many of them. One case went to court but couldn't convict, couldn't punish anyone. A culture of impunity is there. And then, you know, the war on drugs in Thailand, talking about human rights law, you know, aspect of it is that, you know, apart from the rhetoric, clear policy guideline from Thaksin, his interior minister, there was also a shocking and very disturbing element is the criteria that used to assess the success of the campaign. It includes killing the suspects. There was a weekly meeting at the government house, which the Prime Minister worked, where each agency would gather and report it, the results. So they have lists, first of all, compilation of lists of traffickers, suspect traffickers. And the policy was that within the first period, cut-off period, 3 cut-off period, the first period, 25% of those names must be dealt with, including by death. Human Rights Watch went to interview government officials in the countryside. Some of them proudly reported to me that, Sunai, why are you here? We are doing good things. There's no human rights violations. These are disease. These people are disease, germs. No, sorry, not disease. They are germs. They need to be eradicated. And look at the names we used to have in our province. They're all gone. I said, what do you mean by gone? Run away? No, dead. I said, and then when I asked who killed them, they started to be, oops, oh, but they died. No more. And we reported this back to the government. We were praised by the government. Like Bangkok praised us for our achievement. And that phenomenon was seen in every province from the north to the south, from Isan to the west in Bangkok. Every community, you have concerted campaign to put the names together who were drug traffickers. There were real drug traffickers on the list, of course. And there were people who have problems with local authorities. We have a case of human rights activists in Isan, one of the provinces in Isan. Cannot name because the family is still there and the police responsible for the killing is still there too. Found their name on the list because they reported about abuse of power by local units. The man found his name on the list. Later he was murdered. We have people who refuse to loan money to their neighbors. Then the neighbor reported that, you know, these cheap bastards are traffickers. They were killed. We have people who won lottos, didn't tell anyone because they didn't want others to come and take money from them. They were reported of having suspicious wealth, murdered. We have people who refuse to pay briberies. They were murdered. So we had, yes, real drug traffickers and people who found their name on the list and faced deadly consequences as a result of that. So the campaign was brutal, reckless, but deliberate in terms of using extrajudicial killing as one of the measures to achieve the goals. And in these goals, we see a combination of the objectives that set by politicians to score political popularity, combined with deep-rooted police abuse and culture of impunity. This is devastating, a devastating combination. We saw it in Thailand, and I know Philippines have been there in my previous work. So it is likely that this is going to be repeated, maybe even expanded to even larger level in the Philippines. So that's a concern we have. Another thing that I would like to say is, there's another dynamics within the Thai war on drugs back then, because it come into play later on in this kind of the color-coded political conflict in Thailand, that the military at that time, yes, they agree with Thaksin that methamphetamine was number one, surpassing opium and heroin as national security threat. But the origin of the threat was perceived differently from Thaksin. For the Thai military at that time, they saw that ethnic group and Burmese military on the other side of the border were the main sources of methamphetamine. They wanted to focus the pressures and attacks there. In fact, the Thai military launched attacks across the border, targeting factories owned by allies of the Burmese military governments along the border, who were at that time friends with Thaksin. And Thaksin changed the army chief, who then later on became the next prime minister after Thaksin was ousted. General Surayut at that time spearheaded the campaign across the border. It was one of the biggest military operations that Thailand had until Thailand had a border skirmish with Cambodia over the temple. That's another story. But before that, the operation targeting factories, methamphetamine factories along the border. That because the military thought that was the biggest source of methamphetamine. But Thaksin, focusing on his political alliance and, interest with the Burmese government, Burmese military, distracted public attention to domestic sources of methamphetamine, going after small fishes instead. So the focus of the war on drugs policy had very little to do with what happened across the border about those factories in Burma, but instead going after traffickers and their networks and users in Thailand. So that's the main war on drugs, the first phase of the war on drugs in 2003. And then he launched it again in October 2004. And this time Thaksin said, drug dealers and traffickers are heartless and wicked. All of them must be sent to meet the guardian of hell, so that there will not be any drugs in the country. Again, very similar to what Duterte is now saying in the Philippines every day. This is the rhetoric being used by demonizing the targets. Their values as human beings has been removed from them. And there are, this kind of the human face of this tragedy is Human Rights Watch, we title our report about the war on drugs in Thailand as Not Enough Grave. And that is exactly what, when we went to each community in the aftermath of the war on drugs, that's what people said. The victims, government officials, abbots of the temple, there's every day, we don't have enough coffins, we don't have enough grave anymore. The scale was that, that was that appalling that, every day, deaths on the street, every day, newspaper, as part of the campaign, newspaper will put photos of dead bodies and explain how brutally they were slaughtered to send a message. And there is a kind of, very worrying, kind of practice by the monks, by the Sangha in Thailand, Buddhist Sangha, who may not be very compassionate, but They said, you know, because they are not human, they're germs. They're wicked, they're evil. We don't perform the funeral for them. Some of the temples refuse to perform funerals for victims of the war on drugs. The coffin makers refuse to sell coffins. One family that I interviewed, you know, the man who lost 2 children, ended up being coffin maker himself because he learned from making coffins for his own children. That was at Kalasin. So that was the war on drugs as it happened in Thailand in 2003 and 2004. And when I said, you know, across political spectrum, there is consensus of supporting harsh measures against traffickers or suspected traffickers. So when Thaksin was ousted, his nemesis have taken over power later on, again and again with the, you know, even including the last coup. There has been no interest to reopen war on drug cases. The opposite government, Suriyut government and then opposite government, both set up commission of inquiry, but no prosecution to follow afterward. When there was already information out there of very high murder cases, there was no real investigation to differentiate, to look into details of these murder cases. What were the circumstances? How many were killed by the police? What was the justification for those killings? How many were murdered by assassins, various kinds of assassins? Were the victims involved in drugs, and at what level? No, just there, just kind of big round number that everyone can be kind of recycle again and again, but no follow-up prosecution. So police brutality and abusive drug suppression operation continue even after the kind of the peak of the war on drugs 2003, 2004. We still have cases where the suspects were gunned down, police set up string operation, and somehow someone with kind of matching ID passed by the checkpoint. They were gunned down. We have cases like that every year. We have cases that suspect already surrender, handcuffed in the back, and later on found shot dead with handcuff in the front, or no handcuff at all. That still happens. We have cases like shooting of traffickers, mostly heel traps from the north. That happens almost every month. If you monitor Thai media's report, they have cases like that by various task force along the Thai-Burmese border and way up in the north of this, what they call Gong Thap Mot Ant Army, you know, small kind of trafficker carrying backpacks. They was intercepted and murdered. No question asked. No post-mortem inquest. No nothing. And on top of that, no justice. And this will continue to be a feature of anti-drug operations in Thailand. And perhaps this is one, it could be one of the main reasons why, you know, Thailand as a country that signed Rome Statute as well has been reluctant to ratify the Rome Statute to evade the liability of what Sam explained already of crimes against humanity that can be or could be described as, you know, elements of the war on drugs in Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always interesting, this issue of the white noise of violence. I mean, you sometimes get it with elections, and you don't know when there's a lot of violence going on, who's killing who for what. And this is something, and I think this is something that maybe Nick can shine some light on. And also the circumstances of the war on drugs. It's very hard to believe that people want other people killed unless they have some belief that it's going to bring some benefit to them. But anyway, Nick.
Just take one for 1 second, please. Okay. Well,
Yeah, just adding and giving a little bit of a different perspective also to what Sunai said. I mean, it's a very confusing situation, the drug war, until today. I mean, in a way, I mean, everything about the drug war in Thailand from 2003 is surrounded with hypocrisy, lies, misinformation, obfuscation, politicizing, political advantage taking. So it's very difficult to make out what it actually really was. For me personally, it was a very difficult time at the time. I mean, I wasn't into politics that much in those days. I was before and during the drug war. I photographed a lot about street life and drug people in Klong Toei. Also, my wife's family was heavily affected by the methamphetamines, Yaba, at the time. All four of her younger brothers were addicted in her village. A lot of people were addicted. Almost every adult below 40 was either addicted or an habitual user. So during the drug war, many people I photographed, I knew disappeared, were in prison for a long time. Some were killed. But basically coming to the drug war, I mean, everybody says it's Thaksin's drug war, which isn't exactly true. I read you some quote here. If we execute 60,000, the land will rise and our descendants will escape bad karma. That comment didn't come from Thaksin, that came from Privy Council member Pichit Kunlavanit, who later on was one of the strongest opponents of Thaksin. So in a system like in Thailand, with a double polity, one prime minister cannot simply decide to do that. It has to be a consensus. So the drug war in Thailand from 2003 was a consensus of all sectors of power that something had to be done and needed to be done. Now, the problem with that is something really had to be done, because the situation was absolutely terrible. You see here these two photos. That's actually from my wife's birth village, our previous house there. That's one of her brothers and one of her cousins. It was absolutely terrible. At the time, the village was falling apart. Family structures were falling apart. Wives slept around their husbands. They slept with police officers, village authorities, to get drugs, to get drug money. Children were neglected, didn't go to school anymore. Even plots of land which could have been tilled were just laid bare because everything was drug economy. Things changed. I mean, if we go back to the 90s, I mean, the methamphetamines in Thailand started with, in the 90s, in the boom, people used it to work, lorry drivers to drive long hours, harvest workers, and that's also, it started in the village, harvest workers during the brutal long harvest work, students to learn more, while in 97 that completely flipped. In 97, with the economic crisis, I mean, it was a desperate situation for a lot of the common people, and that's when amphetamines changed from becoming a tool to work harder, a tool into escapism, and that's when this whole village is deteriorated. And post-crisis governments didn't have any real program for these drug addiction. So drug addiction, it was a free for all. By like 2001, 2002. Prices, for example, in Bangkok, in Klong Toei, which was the epicenter, it was like, not in wholesale, was like, normal per pill was like between 40 and 50 baht per pill. Outside Klong Toei slum, it was about 60 to 70, sometimes 80 baht a pill. Upcountry in the villages, it was like between 80 and 100 baht per pill. Or only closer to the Burmese border, it was then cheaper again. So it was like really cheap, and the whole economy was into drug economy. Now, the next truth about the drug war, we talked about the killings. Now, there's this number floating around about 2,500 killings. That actually is not entirely correct. Now, to go into the report which Sunai already mentioned, and that one we can quite clearly say that this is not a pro-Thaksin commission. I mean, there was many very strong opponents of Thaksin in that commission, so we can assume that the numbers were quite correct there. Basically, that report also lists the average killings in the same months, February to April, in the 3 months, February up to April, in the years from 2001 to 2005. The average was between 450 to 500 killings per month, murders. In 2003, during these drug war 3 months, the peak 3 months, the killing jumped up to 853 cases, average. Basically means a total, you have a total of on every average year in these 3 months between 1,300 and 1,500 murder cases. In this 2003 3 months drug war, you had I think it was 2,600 cases with 2,873 deaths, and identified were 1,370 deaths were drug related, meaning a drug war, and officially acknowledged a number of 50 extrajudicial killings, which I think will be a bit more. But I believe that the number of 1,370 deaths is rather accurate, I would say. I mean, and as Sunai said, I mean, there's almost no, I think the only ones were Konkan was somehow brought to court. Galasin. But more or less there was nothing really, there's no prosecution and nothing really. Now, there's another context which also never really gets talked about. Why did they do that so quickly? At the time, you know, one of the government's main programs were microloan schemes, where lots of monies were pushed into communities, into villages, for all sorts of housing, agricultural, whatever. Now, if a drug economy wouldn't have been destroyed, all that money from the government would have went straight into the drug economy. I mean, that was all part of you know, the government's promise to repair the damage of the '97 crisis. Now, one of the big, you know, conundrums, it's a moral conundrum, the whole thing. And it's also, I think, a problem for the Philippines later on as well. A lot of people argue that it didn't work. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around that apparently Thai and Thaksin wanted to replace the drug mafias with his own mafias. That's all crap. Reality is, it worked. And I'm pretty sure that in the Philippines it will also work. I mean, I don't have the statistics or anything, but from my personal environment, such as the communities I photographed, my wife's village. In my wife's village, after the drug war, drugs were not available anymore. Methamphetamine was not available, not for any money in the world. It wasn't there anymore. In many of the urban communities, obviously it was still there for much higher prices for quite a long time, but it was much reduced into manageable levels. So there's a big moral conundrum. It's a huge problem because it sets somehow a precedent that these kind of horrific extrajudicial killings can work. It's I don't know what I should say. It's a very difficult problem. I mean,
but you're not suggesting that there isn't a drugs problem today in Thailand. I mean,
say again, please.
You're not suggesting that there is not a drugs problem.
There is one. I mean, like, what I'm part of it. I mean, like, we still have a drug problem. I mean, I have arrests in the Zoe I'm living. We receive regular attention by the police, especially in the last month. There was one arrest directly in front of my gate. I thought it was some young kids fighting, and suddenly I saw, oops, it was a couple of cops I knew undercover cops I knew who arrested one big-time dealer in front of my house, wrangled him down. He gave up, and then he disappeared before the other gang kids in my Zoe could free him. But they were on an outing, so they had. But basically, the other day, just in a very sad case. A girl in my Zoe and her husband were arrested with 25 pills. They have a very cute 3-year-old daughter who all the time came by our house, and now her parents will be gone for a long time, because it was also not the first offense. I mean, the day when she was arrested, or the day before, she came by our house, and I already thought something is wrong, because she was again completely emaciated and her eyes were bulging big. So we still have a drug problem, but it is, from my personal assessment, it's not yet as bad as it was before the 2003 drug war. But it's on the way. I mean, like, it started coming back, the problem, with the political problems rising here. Because a lot of intelligence units involved in drug suppression have been withdrawn from drug suppression and put into politics, and they are still with politics. I mean, from military intelligence, from all sort of the intelligence, they're mostly now looking at politics, while drug is, I think, is back to normal. So I expect, you know, if the political conflict continues, drugs will come back, and one day we may see another drug war here in Thailand again.
This idea of moral relativity, where you have something that could be shown to be better for society in the big...
I forgot something completely with talking too much. Because I have also a few photos, sorry about that. That's, for example, a case, one of the cases I photographed. That was in still the first month were the most killings. In the second and third months, the killings went down. That was here in Bangkok, one case. I mean, a lot of these cases were a bit funny. For example, suddenly then they found a bag with a lot of amphetamines. This case is also interesting because you see the police officer here with the... exactly, Pukan. He has two names, Pukan Ho Dam, which he doesn't like to hear. Pukan Dam, that's the name he likes to hear. Now, he was very prominent in a drug war. Was also raised by the government then, but in 2012 he switched sides, and funnily enough, so he resigned from the police force and worked then as an advisor to the Bangkok metropolitan government, together with Kraisak Chunhavan, who was one of the most prominent anti-drug war activists. But for some strange reason, they didn't seem to have a problem to work together. So that's what I meant, you know, when I started off with the hypocrisy in the drug war. That's the finger pointing. I mean, there was this person was shot like from close range because he saw gunpowder residue at the head, and you see the finger pointing, and then there's another little bag of drug which fell out of his motorcycle. So there's a possibility that something was planted. Who the hell knows? That's another encounter. That's an encounter killing. Apparently, it was a sting operation when the two dealers were apparently resisting arrest. It took 2 hours before they let us close to the crime scene. There you see the gun there. Oops, doesn't reach there. It's another one. And there you see the atmosphere. I mean, here they found the drugs, and that was the police officers who did the killing. They were congratulated by their bosses. That was kind of the atmosphere in those drug war killings.
Okay. So I'd like to go back to this idea of moral relativity, that if you can actually produce a better result for society, which is what Nick is suggesting may have happened with the war on drugs here, when it's completely illegal and it violates every standard that we all think we support, how do you two, as human rights defenders, feel? I mean, it must put you in a very awkward position. Is there a greater good? Is there an argument to be made here?
This is not a moral conundrum.
What is it then?
Just to be clear, the state being involved in killing people is bad, and that badness trumps everything else. I mean, just so I don't see a conundrum, but the clarity of that view is because there is no evidence in Thailand or anywhere else of any government killing its way out of a drug problem.
That's wrong.
There just isn't, and I think
we saw it in the communities.
Well,
I'm living in a drug community.
Well, this is one of the and so I think this is very interesting in the point that Sunai was making and the point that Jonathan was making is the cynicism of this. to say that you have seen it in one community
No, not
and
just
that
one.
therefore this can be applied across the country belies the government's own statistics. And today, we have 300,000 people in jail in Thailand, whereas 5 years ago we had 180,000 people. And that extra 180,000 or 120,000 are all, by the government's own admission, drugs related. So the drug problem in Thailand, in Latin America, everywhere in the world. Now, the one country in the world that has the toughest drug laws, zero tolerance policy, possession is the death penalty, is Iran, which year on year on year has a rising drug rate. So this notion of somehow I saw it, my cousin stopped taking meth, therefore as a national policy this is good, I think needs to be challenged. But what this is very powerful, as Jonathan pointed out, and as Thaksin did, is to get votes. And the fear in the Philippines, driven largely actually by social media and the media in some extent, is phenomenal. And to come back from there, and then to ask, as we did Thaksin back then when I was here with Sunai, and to ask President Duterte, are you providing rehabilitation for anyone? Are you providing assistance for these people? And the answer is, right now, not really. There are, but I'll end by saying what has been fascinating about all this and the similarities between the two countries is that Thaksin in his own way was also interesting in that it split the civil society and the human rights community in the country, as Duterte has done. People who support Duterte's policy toward the communists, for instance, still favor him. People who support Duterte's views towards mining companies still support him. And part of the discussion in the Philippines was to remind people of what happened in Thailand. When Thaksin was really doing this, he was extremely popular. I remember Sunai coming and talking about this, and a lot of the people who are now vehement Thaksin opponents at that time said, no, we need a strong man. Thailand needs this. This is a horrific problem. You guys don't understand. It's a moral conundrum, and we come on the side of killing people and ruining institutions. As is happening in the Philippines, we pointed out that this is eroding institutions, and this is eroding the rule of law, and that this will end in tears. And that is precisely what is happening in the Philippines, because the media, as Jonathan explained, has become, the Philippines media was quite powerful, but has become very polarized itself. But he has a supermajority in Congress, almost unheard of, which means that the checks and balances of the system are broken. He attacked the judiciary, but also just to give a sense of how unfactual this kind of nonsense is, and how one episode, I saw this in the village and therefore national policy. He went after the judiciary. He provided a list of, I think, 10 judges. And he said, these judges are related to the drugs trade, and they should all be fired. The Chief Justice responded very reasonably and said, well, first of all, 2 of these judges are dead. 4 of them are either in family courts or commercial courts and have nothing to do with the drugs. And the other ones, we will take your statements as a complaint, and we will deal with them under the judicial process. That's when Duterte responded and said, if the judge wants to stand up to me, what is he like? For me to declare martial law? Now, the next day he said, oh, it was just a joke. But to joke about martial law in the Philippines is a grossly irresponsible act. And so I just want to end by saying these are, I mean, we can't be in a non-factual world.
We are in a non-factual world, that's a problem.
Right. Whether, so we need to see facts. We do need to see the facts. And to end by saying that regardless of popularity, though, the law on this is the law. And of course, it's been tremendously disappointing that after all these years, Thaksin has not been charged and prosecuted for all these crimes against humanity, which he should have been, whereas we've been focusing on lot of other crap. This, the one where he was absolutely, clearly responsible, we failed on. And I don't think, though, that Duterte is in as good of a position as Thaksin was actually. I think his statements are more egregious, and I think the scale of the crimes is serious enough. I would expect them, when he responded to the ICJ's complaints, he said, I don't give a shit about these human rights son of bitches. I'm going to retire with the reputation of Idi Amin. Now, that just ages the man, because who remembers Idi Amin? But it was a phenomenal statement, because I wanted to say, how do you want to end up? In sad retirement in Saudi Arabia? I mean, that's not a good way to end. But I do hope to see him there.
If I may add.
Sorry, but you've made very specific comments about particular villages.
Yeah, I
where
want to,
you
I
saw
want to
benefit.
answer
Okay.
on this one. I want to answer
All
on
right.
this one,
But-
because a couple of things Sam said are not actually true. First of all, it's not just I saw it in one village, because you see what I'm saying repeated under so many communities. Now, fact of the drug situation in Thailand was, and that's a couple of the facts, we talk about factuality. Factuality is that at the time, before the drug war, the due legal process did not function. Absolutely. And it's not, I mean, it's not that the drug war eroded the due process. The due process
It
was
wasn't there in
eroded
the first place. Okay,
a
right.
long time ago.
Yeah.
Now, part of the factuality is also, part of the
Stay in the microphone, because you're
part of the factuality is also that what are you going to say to people who grew up in communities, like in a community where I'm living, where parents who know that when their children turn 12, 13 years old, they will get into the drug world. What are you going to say to them? They don't have time to wait for a long judicial process, because I don't know if you have children, I have a son. Time flies by. You don't have the time to wait until certain judicial processes are taking years and years and years. Because when your son turns 13, 14 years old, he will be in the drug business, because everybody else is.
All right,
That was the factuality of the situation before the drug war in Thailand. And it becomes the factuality now again.
Okay, just on a general point, Sam, is it your impression that the legal system in the Philippines is weaker or stronger than the failed system that we're talking about in Thailand?
The legal system in the Philippines was criticized on two separate issues very, very concretely. One is on dealing with crimes. It's not that the system necessarily is as corrupt, I would say, as perhaps it was in some other places, but it's simply very, very slow.
Yeah,
It's
same
a
as
very,
Thailand.
very slow process. And in dealing with extrajudicial executions, because of the involvement in the past of the government, cases just did not move forward. And that, of course, was also the situation in Thailand. Cases just could not be filed and could not move forward. So, but one of the things we haven't seen from President Duterte, as we didn't see from President Thaksin, or Prime Minister Thaksin, is, you know, how do you fix that problem? Again, you can't just kill yourself out. And words have meanings, and we have to be careful when we say everyone gets into the drug trade. Well, I mean, everyone is a
Everyone.
word.
I mean, in many communities in Thailand, I meant everyone.
Okay. Right. Questions? There's more people in the room.
I'm Christopher Moore. I'm a member here of the club. I have actually two questions, and I think really for Jonathan and Sam, who were recently in the Philippines. And the first one is the role of social media, because I think that's a major distinction between the war on drugs at the time of Thaksin and the current situation. I'm not certain quite what the penetration of social media is in the Philippines, but I'd be curious as to what kind of influence that new technology and communication is having on feeding the support or the criticism of the current drug war in the Philippines. And then the second question is really, I would like Jonathan and Sam perhaps to make some kind of a prediction as to whether they see an end to the current campaign in the Philippines. The one in Thailand lasted about 3 months the first time out, and not very long in 2004. So they were kind of a very short, at least in terms of time, campaign. Is there any indication in the Philippines as to the government's position of how long the current war on drugs will go at the current rate?
It's
okay,
6 months actually, because when he campaigned,
That was
Duterte said explicitly that he would eradicate all crime in 6 months.
He's actually talking about going on to stage 2, which he says will be putting the 3.7 million people into military camps. But how on earth that's going to rehabilitate them, I don't know. On social media penetration in the Philippines is very, very high. Very high uses of Facebook, quite high use of Twitter as well. And there's no doubt it has an incredibly polarizing effect. I was stunned by the waterfall of comments I got, a lot of it coordinated. And President Duterte has a very good social media team, and they're very skilled, and they are organizing targeted campaigns against the people they perceive as their real critics. I mean, the BBC got an organized complaints campaign. They recognized it immediately. They got 220 complaints on my piece within 45 minutes, all using the same language. And it came, ironically, from a very high-profile transgender human rights defender who is now a fanatic pro-Duterte supporter, and she's gone all out. She's absolutely going for me. It's incredible. She's very, very smart. She's not even in the Philippines. But she's helping organize people. Others are getting organized as well. It's a very intense social media environment to be in, and you actually engaging is hard. There are people, I've got death threats, I've got a lot of abuse, I mean, it's just the usual swearing. I've got some people genuinely appealing to me, but a massive torrent of it's just, I can't go through it all. And that is, it creates as social media does. I mean, I spoke to Filipino people there who don't like what Duterte is doing, and they're losing friends. They're having to keep low profile. The fixer who worked for us and helped us has had to remain anonymous. She doesn't want people to know that she's worked for us. It's very, very poisonous. And this is really new in the Philippines. I can't ever remember seeing this kind of an environment before.
So it's light relief after what you get in Thailand.
It's great to come back.
Does anybody want to add on that?
Just on that, as Jonathan mentioned, there are elements of the Trump phenomenon in this too. And it's because social media lends itself to pithy, angry responses. It's much more complicated to say, fight drugs through rehabilitation, strengthening the judicial system. I mean, that's already your 140 characters are up. Much easier to say, kill the bastards. Bam. That's already gone. So that element is absolutely there. And as Jonathan said, again, the erosion of civil society and democracy in the Philippines is a significant worry, because this was a country that was in many ways, again, progressive in Southeast Asia, and we now have a country that actually wants to bring back the death penalty after having abolished it, and lowering the criminal age from 15 to 9. So this is something that the democratic process in the Philippines, I'm not sure, can handle. We'll see.
Okay. I can see George there.
Yes, George McLeod. First question is, if we look at the drug war here in Thailand, don't these types of situations turn into score settling opportunities where the drug war morphs into people saying, "Oh, I don't like my neighbor very much. I'll just tell the police that is a drug dealer." Isn't that what happened in Thailand, Nick? And secondly, I guess I'll use a point that Sam made as a segue to it. Sam, you brought up Iran. Despite its harsh drug laws, actually Iran is noted for having one of the most progressive drug treatment programs in the world. And so I guess it would lead me to the question of, could these same results not be achieved in other ways rather than sort of shooting people, rather than through treatment, for example? Thank you.
All right. First, can we let Walden in, because he has finally arrived? I think you had to make a murderous deadline on an article. Never happens to the rest of us. But anyway, very, very welcome. Walden Bello is a distinguished Philippine columnist and academic, and a former member of the House of Representatives, a professor of sociology and public administration. We've been through quite a lot of detail about Thailand, and we've been through the legal details about what's going on in the Philippines. What would be very good to hear from you is your feeling about what the political spin is. Why is Duterte doing this? Is this a way of striking at injustice, distracting people, making them feel better? But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you could.
Shall we not first answer George's question before, otherwise we forget it?
We'll come back to George's question. Sorry, George.
Thank you very much. And as I had communicated to the organizers, I would be late because of meeting a murderous deadline in New York. So basically, let me just share some of my thoughts on this issue, some of the political spin-offs. I don't think we can understand Duterte and his relatively smashing victory in these elections unless we realize the history of the last 30 years since 1986 when the EDSA revolution took place. What we had was basically an uprising that did create a lot of expectations about significant political change and economic change that would take place. And that is very much reflected in the 1987 Constitution, which is a very interesting mix of liberal and social democratic aspirations. Liberal in the sense of, political liberties and civil rights being respected, and social democratic in the sense that it did promise income and asset redistribution, particularly land reform. So what happened, however, is on the political front, what we had was a situation that basically was fairly quickly how would you put it? Taken over by elite politics. Yes, we had democratic competition, but it was really competition among elites that were favored by the tremendous resources that it would take to win elections. And those, of course, were resources that were available mainly to local and regional dynasties. There was an effort to institutionalize some form of popular representation in the form of party list system. Mainly 20% of the House seats would be reserved for people elected at large, supposedly to represent marginalized groups. So basically, I think it was fairly disappointing the way that what was expected to be really much more significant people empowerment ended up basically as competitive elite democratic politics. So that's one. On the economic front, I think it's fairly clear. What happened from the very beginning was pretty much a straitjacketing of the Philippine economy because 1986 to 89, Marcos had left behind a $26 billion debt, and the big demand that was put by the international banking community, backed up by the World Bank and the IMF, was for the Philippines to pay that off. And we had debt repayment within the context of a structural adjustment program that was fairly harsh. And we, between 1990 and 2010, the Philippines' growth rate was about 1.5% per annum as an average. We had the second lowest growth rate in Southeast Asia, the lowest being Brunei. And as you know, Brunei doesn't need to grow. And basically, there is some truth to the fact that we became the sick man of Asia, but there was cronyism, there was a great deal of corruption, but I think central to the whole thing was a neoliberal restructuring of the economy that was particularly very marked during the Fidel Ramos administration. So this is the sort of political and economic straitjacket that was bursting at the seams. Okay, it exploded briefly during the Arab Strata period in 2002. Okay, thanks. But that was easily contained. But it was called EDSA 3, and it was a real uprising. I was there at the time, and you could feel, that this was not regular Philippine politics. This was class politics, and there was hatred out on the streets for the middle class, for the elites, to the point whereby people who were seen as favoring the elites that had displaced Estrada in their view, media people were beaten up. So that was contained, and I think, therefore, when this latest elections came around, and I'm just going to briefly go through it, is I think that Duterte was able to become the lightning rod of all these feelings of grievances and resentment that had been percolating below the surface but had not been able to break through the kind of liberal democratic elite politics and the liberal democratic discourse of human rights and of rights and etc. So when Duterte came up and basically began to speak a language that was very different from the normal political discourse and the kind of political discourse that usually appeals to human rights and democracy, etc., etc., this sort of provided a sort of a real liberating discourse for people. So that, in fact, the more he defied civilized, quote unquote, political discourse, the more popular he became. And so that was one thing. Secondly is that he was essentially running on the central issue of crime and drugs. And basically, that's what he kept on pressing. And I think that he hit a gold mine because it was an issue that had an interclass appeal. It wasn't just to the middle class, it wasn't just to the elite, but, there were all these, poor communities that in fact had been filled with drug pushers and drug users, and so that sort of was a very resonant kind of thing. Thirdly, he did have a rhetoric of being anti-establishment, okay, and the attacks that he made on the oligarchy. He attacked the World Trade Organization as the central problem for Philippine agriculture. And I was surprised. I think he read some of the stuff that we had been writing, because, he had his grasp of what the WTO had done to Philippine agriculture. I was quite surprised at how he had mastered that. And, of course, his language about the elite, calling them cunts or coño, okay, which is, something that to people was very refreshing. So that's really what happened. And I was campaigning for the Senate at that time, and I witnessed firsthand how here was a political phenomenon that was really massively shaking the country. In practically all the cities, big cities you would be visiting, people would be waiting for him for hours, okay? And just waiting and, just being stirred up. In practically every city I visited, you got the same reports that people were not waiting for propaganda materials because propaganda materials were not being available. They were making the propaganda materials themselves and buying stickers, poor tricycle drivers doing that and buying stickers and that sort of thing. So basically, I think in a way, he had the perfect opponent. The perfect opponent being Mar Rojas, who was a true blue aristocrat and, was somebody who exuded, what became seen as the yellow kind of personality. He had the perfect, he was the perfect embodiment of being a klutz. Okay, everything he touched seemed to go up in flames, and so this was the kind of political dynamic that went on and led up to his victory. So the last thing I would say then is that I think he's pretty serious about this drug thing.
Yeah.
I think his view is that this is the central problem of the country. That's one. Secondly is that he feels that the only way to deal with this is fairly radically, which is you have to kill people. He doesn't make a distinction between drug users and drug pushers because in his view, drug users eventually end up as drug pushers in order to be able to sustain their habit. And he doesn't believe in rehabilitation. He's spoken about it several times. And he, of course, I think he's been fed these ideas about how drugs basically alter the brain and make people incapable of being rehabilitated. So, he's fairly serious about that. The rest of his program, I think, is catch and catch can kind of thing. I think, yes, he does want to make peace with the CPP, NPA, the communists. He's brought them into his cabinet, although they've become a bit uneasy lately about being the cabinet whose central campaign is to kill, people extrajudicially. And he's made some good appointments from NGO's point of view. Gina Lopez as environmental minister, who's begun to crack down on mining. But the overall contours of the economic policy, I think, don't depart from the traditional paradigm. His NEDA, the National Economic Development Authority advisor, head, is a neoliberal economist. I did work with him on reproductive rights, but pretty much it's sort of straightforward neoliberal thinking. I doubt whether there will be much of a break when it comes to the economic policy front. The last thing I would just like to say is Duterte has said that all he's interested in is 6 years, and that after 6 years, I'll be gone. Well, I think I take him as his word that when he said that initially, that that he was probably serious that it would just be 6 years. But then the problem, of course, is that once you're in power, this thing begins to be a commitment that might begin to change. And the last thing, just one last thing, is his people want to make sure that what happened to Arab Strada in 2002 is not repeated. And their analysis is that the problem with Estrada was that he did not build up a mass populist base. He did not organize it. And they're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so his people right now, many of whom are ex-activists, some of the best organizers, are now trying to organize this thing that would serve as the base for what they call the Duterte revolution. So that even if Duterte, say, dies in office, or he really refuses to run in terms of a changed constitution, their hope is that there will be a political movement that can be institutionalized and will carry on the quote-unquote Duterte revolution. So that's really where I think the Philippines is at this point. He's extremely popular. Okay, human rights activists, are on the extreme defensive. The line right now, when people like me come up and talk about human rights, is that you are defending the criminals. Where were you when these criminals were killing innocent people? So this is the kind of thing that's spewed out in the internet and is very much something that activists, human rights people have to deal with every day. And so it's now I think how it's the situation in the country is extremely volatile at this point in time, and this could end up in a further consolidation of executive power, which may or may not be institutionalized, but certainly Duterte knows that he has massive popularity, and that's his battering ram at this point for whichever direction he wants to go. Thanks.
Thank you. George, can you get back and ask your question very briefly? Because I feel awful.
I can still remember most of it.
Yeah, we don't want to get too distracted. Before you do that,
thought maybe Nick was...
before you ask it, Walden, what's your sense of where this is going to end? Are we going upwards? Is this killing going to get worse? Is it plateauing, or what? I mean, 3 months for Thaksin, 6 months for the declared policy of Duterte. What do you think's happening?
My sense is it's probably going to get worse.
Right.
And I think it's going to get worse because it has tremendous popular support. So if there's a break in the economic front, if the economy begins to sour because of policies and that sort of thing, then there might be some sort of a possibility that it might change. But right now, I think he's told people, and he's told the press, and he's been very candid, that he has to accomplish what he wants to do before his popularity ratings go down. So I think let's brace ourselves for the fact that this is not going to be over pretty soon.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly,
Tight.
I mean, is it even accurate to be talking about these things as drug wars? I mean, don't they, as in Thailand, just degenerate into score-settling matches? And secondly, is treatment and other options not a better one than just violence of that type?
Okay, first part of the question, as Sunai has mentioned, there were quite a few such cases where score settling was involved. I came across one such case where somebody who was in conflict with the police in the underground money lending business was executed. Though I would say the majority of cases I'm aware of and I came across were clearly involved in the drug business, smaller scale, mostly of course small scale dealers. As to what you said, rehabilitation programs. I mean, let's not forget. I mean, the drug war in Thailand was not just comprised of the killings. There were certain amateurish rehabilitation programs, such as in military barracks, but they were also actually not too bad ones. I mean, for the first time in Thai history, there was a separation made between user and dealer. Before, there was no separation made. Secondly, for example, there was, for heroin addicts, there were methadone programs. And heroin addicts, even foreign heroin addicts, got from these methadone programs cards which excused them from these rampant urine test-ins at the time, so they were not falsely accused. So that was, so you had at that same time, you had other programs such as To Be Number One program, which was run by Princess Ubonrat, which was, I think, about community-free drugs. So all that linked to each other. So it wasn't just the killings. Well, the killings were a major part of it. The drug war in 2003 was not just killings.
Right,
well,
good.
If I may add, you know, the score settling and false allegation will not, you know, cannot be used to decategorize what happened then in 2003 as it was not a war on drugs. It was a war on drugs because the government first of all called it a war on drugs. The criteria used to assess achievement involve death toll of suspect on the list and how many percentage that they achieve in removing those names from the list each month. We cannot call it either way, but it's a war on drugs, and it was a serious violation that cannot be justified for whatever reason, cannot be excused for whatever reasons. And on your question about the rehabilitation, yes, for the first time, Thaksin, you know, raised the separation of drug users and drug traffickers. But in practice, there was no division between the two categories. For Human Rights Watch, we went to interview drug users. We went to interview the operators of the rehabilitation center. Most of them happened inside prisons, inside military camps. Police simply, they were waiting outside of those centers for drug users to come out and then rearrest them. It was become kind of conveyor belt because they were compelled to present the results to please the government in Bangkok. There were competition among each district, each villages, each province to show the numbers, the higher number of people killed, the higher number of people arrested, the higher number of people being sent to rehabilitation, including those people with card, as Nick said. They should be recognized as drug users and exempted. No, they were easy target. The police told me that they were the easier target because they have the card to identify themselves.
To prove it,
easy.
it was certified.
Yeah. And many people were murdered too. Easy target.
Okay, question.
Lindsay Murdoch, Fairfax Media. This guy has come up from Davao. He's the classic unprecedented outsider. He has 91% support, as Jonathan said. But he's obviously deeply upset the traditional elite who have run the place forever. And I'm not sure about the military. How will they react? Do you think the panel think that there might be a coup, or are they plotting already, or are they just sort of overwhelmed by the 91% support? How is it likely to play out?
Well, yes, you're probably best qualified to answer it. I mean, is there anybody there that would knock him over?
No. I think that even the military is intimidated by his two things: the obvious electoral support, the popularity, and by his personality. So I doubt very much at this point if you have, quote unquote, a liberal wing of the officer corps that would dare to go against him. So I would not see him as being threatened on that score. And of course, recently he's been very, very assiduous in courting the military and going to different events and, you know, highly publicized young officers giving personal testaments about how they will die for him. And, you know, you have these photos of Duterte and, you know, different military units. Very, very, very interesting in the sense that you have this clenched fists kind of, you know, this is it, you know. So, you know, there's that. So I doubt very much if that will come from there. It's not going to come from the civilian sector of the government. Basically, the Liberal Party has exploded, and 97% of the Liberal Party, in just a few weeks, all swore allegiance to Duterte. I mean, of course, swore allegiance meaning exaggeration. There's probably only about 7 to 10 people in the opposition in the House of Representatives out of 296 members of Congress. And out of the 24 members of the Senate, only about 2 are in the opposition. The Liberal Party senators that won in the elections immediately went over to what's his name, to Duterte. So he has basically tremendous control of the civilian sector, and many people say the Supreme Court is also intimidated at this point in time, and it's not seeking a quarrel with Duterte, although the Supreme Court Chief Justice did make a statement about Duterte. Hey, the judges that you mentioned in this list, that's our prerogative. And then Duterte came out and said, what do you want me to do, declare martial law? And so it's been sort of effective in doing that. So where is the opposition coming from at this point? Mainly civil society groups who have begun to come together in basically a coalition that's called I Defend. About more than 50 groups have come together. But, and that and the Commission on Human Rights, which is a fairly beleaguered institution at this point in time. They receive threats every day, sometimes threats of being burned down. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at this point in time. And
right, we're running late, so we'll take one final question.
Hi, Stay Leopold. I just have a question for Mr. Zafiri. If I understand correctly, there's enough evidence to make a case against President Duterte. So what, in practice, would now be needed for an international criminal court to start prosecuting him for his crimes against humanity? And has anybody pressed charges? And if not, why not?
Well, to catch him would be a good start.
Yeah. Look, realistically, the international criminal courts, you have to get the attention of the prosecutor. Now, anyone can submit a file. And so I think there's even somehow a case against Abbasid that one of Thaksin's crazy lawyers filed. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of nonsense, but I mean, potentially whether you can get the attention of the prosecutor, to get the attention of the prosecutor, you have to really have a strong case, and you have to have essentially global political movement in that direction. One of the key legal issues is the notion of complementarity. What that means in legal jargon is the ICC won't go into a country situation unless it can see that the country's own courts cannot handle it. And that's a key issue in the Philippines. We didn't talk about that. I mean, the courts of the Philippines are beleaguered, but they have stood up a little bit. We'll see if there will be a constitutional crisis in that regard or not. But on the flip side, something that has been very troubling is both President Duterte as well as high-level officials, including the chief of police, saying to police officers, I've got your back. Go ahead and kill people. I'll make sure nothing happens to you. Now, that kind of language can potentially, when people start filing cases, when the Human Rights Commission starts filing cases, when lawyers start filing cases and they don't go anywhere, that can be used to show that ICC action is required. But I think the ICC is, not immediately on the cards in the Philippines. But I mentioned this issue of universal jurisdiction and the idea of lawsuits being filed elsewhere. In a lot of Western European jurisdictions, you can file criminal charges. Again, that's complicated, but I would expect that to happen. I would also expect people to start gathering information now about a lawsuit in the U.S. Walden very much mentioned the ambivalence of the Communist Party and the MPA, because they were the ones who pushed the lawsuit against Marcos on human rights grounds. So I think that I know that there are activist lawyers on the communist side who on the one hand are very happy that their buddy has won, but they understand that all of the rhetoric that they used, all of the laws that they used are now going to be pointing back at them. So I'm not holding my breath right now for international action. But in response to what can stop this, if this starts moving in year after year, if the pace and ferocity of this continues, I would start expecting to see cases popping up, and that does start eroding the credibility of a national leader.
Right. On that note, I think I'll wrap it up. One of the things that's very obvious is that this whole issue is keeping everybody very busy. Walden sneaks in late, but thank you very much for coming. Jonathan for racing back from Manila. Sam, Sunai and Nick, thank you all very much. I'm pretty sure that we'll have more programs on this particular topic.